There is a sweetness that doesn't come in crystals. It doesn't pour from a bag. It doesn't dissolve instantly and disappear. It comes wrapped inside something modern sugar was engineered to remove. Fiber. Sweetness that arrives with its brakes still attached. And long before low sugar labels, long before diet wars, long before anyone argued about carbs on a screen, people in the hottest places on Earth built entire food traditions around that idea. Sweetness you could live on, not sweetness that left you chasing more. In the desert, you don't just need calories, you need calories that last, and there is a tree that makes that kind of sweetness. Not as candy, not as a syrup, not as a refined ingredient shipped in barrels, as pods, dry, sun-cured pods that store themselves on the branch. Pods that can be roasted, ground, and turned into a flour that tastes like caramel and smoke, a sweetness that behaves more like a meal than a treat. And once you learn what it is, the question becomes impossible to ignore. If this existed, if this grew in heat where fields fail, if it fed people for generations, why did the world replace it with sugarcane? Why did sweetness move from trees and dry pods to plantations and refineries, to a global commodity that demanded ships, mills, and endless buying? This is the story of Mesquite, Prosopis, one of the most overlooked food trees in the modern world. PMC+1. And it's the story of what happens when a food doesn't fit the system that wants to control it. Welcome to Forgotten Earth Vault. A quick note before we open this vault. This story is educational. History, food systems, nutrition, documented observation. It is not medical advice. Now, begin where the tree begins, with survival. Mesquite does not grow where life is easy. It grows where heat lasts too long, where rain arrives late or not at all, where soil is thin, rocky, exhausted. In many places it grows anyway, because it is built to. And the genius of mesquite is not just that it survives. It produces long pods that ripen in the dry season, pods that don't rot quickly like fruit, pods that dry naturally, right on the tree, pods you can gather and keep. This is not an accident. This is architecture, food designed by evolution for scarcity. The Sonoran desert is not known for abundance, and yet people there created an abundant system out of a tree. Across the region, mesquite pod flour has been a valued traditional food, hand-roasted, dried, then ground, linked to the culinary traditions of the Pima, Tohono O'odham, Seri, Apache, Cocopa, Maricopa, and others. Fondazione slow food, not as a novelty, not as a superfood, as a staple ingredient, sweet, smoky, practical. Even today, communities describe grinding pods into flour for breads, pancakes, cookies, sometimes as a way to reduce reliance on white flour, because the pods were never just sweetness. They were substance. O'odham Action News. And that is the first thing modern nutrition conversations often miss. Mesquite isn't sugar. Mesquite is sweetness packaged as food. A pod is not a molecule. A pod is a system. When you grind the whole pod, you don't just get sweet taste. You get fiber. You get protein. You get minerals. You get plant compounds that don't survive refinement. Researchers analyzing mesquite pod flour have repeatedly found what traditional food systems already understood. It is unusually high in dietary fiber and contains meaningful protein for a flour-like ingredient. PMC+2, Science Direct +2. One scientific review notes pod flour from a Mexican mesquite species with roughly 10% protein and crude fiber reported in the mid-20s% range, with most of the remainder being carbohydrates. PMC. That matters for a simple reason. Refined sugar is speed. It is engineered to be accessed immediately. But mesquite pod flour is not designed for speed. It is designed for endurance, sweetness that takes time to unlock. Not because someone added a chemical trick, Because the sweetness is trapped in structure, inside fiber, inside a whole food matrix. That matrix is the difference between a product and a meal. And once you see that, you start to understand why Mesquite was never going to win the global sweetness war. Because the global system didn't choose sweetness based on what the body needed. It chose sweetness based on what empires could move. There are two paths sweetness can take. One path is local. Sweetness that grows across landscapes. Sweetness that appears seasonally. Sweetness harvested by communities. Sweetness that stores itself. Sweetness that doesn't require factories. Mesquite is that path. The other path is industrial. Sweetness that can be concentrated into enormous fields, cut in bulk, milled fast, refined into uniform crystals, stored for years, traded like currency. Sugarcane is that path. Sugarcane became a commodity because it was perfect for scale, and scale is not just agriculture. Scale is power. In the early modern world, sugar moved from rare luxury to mass demand, driving production systems that reshaped land, labor, and economies. Digital collections. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations became a major economic engine, relying heavily on enslaved labor and later other coerced labor systems. An entire world built to turn cane into exportable sweetness. Liverpool Museums +1. This is not an abstract history lesson. It is the hidden architecture behind modern sweetness. Because refined sugar isn't just a food, it's an infrastructure. Plantation economies, shipping lanes, mills, refineries, warehouses, trade policy, price shocks, global dependence. Sugarcane sweetness was not simply tastier, it was more controllable. And control is what makes a crop profitable at scale. Now look back at Mesquite. Mesquite doesn't grow as a monoculture commodity by default. It grows scattered. It grows on the margins. It grows in places where machines don't dominate. Its harvest is irregular. Its pods ripen with seasons, not deadlines. Its best form, pod flour, does not become identical crystals. Mesquite sweetness refuses uniformity. Which means mesquite sweetness resists commodification. And in a world where the dominant food system rewards whatever can be commodified, resisting commodification is a kind of invisibility. So mesquite gets relabeled, not as food, as brush, as encroachment, as a problem. In many grassland regions of the US, mesquite expansion has been treated as a management concern, part of shrub encroachment that can reduce forage for livestock, leading to control campaigns using combinations of mechanical removal, herbicides, and prescribed burning. U.S. Forest Service +2, USFS Research and Development +2. Pause on that. A tree that can feed people is removed because it interferes with a different economy. Not because it is useless, because it competes with a land use model that values grass for animals over pods for humans. And once a plant is framed as a management problem, the conversation changes. A food becomes an invader. A traditional resource becomes brush control. A harvest becomes cleanup. The tree's value doesn't disappear. It is overwritten. And overwriting is one of the quietest forms of erasure. There was no global ban on mesquite pod flour, no dramatic prohibition, just a slow shift in what land was for. And what foods were considered real. The modern store teaches people a narrow list of sweetness options. White sugar, brown sugar, corn syrup, cane syrup, artificial sweeteners, products built on refineries. It does not teach pod flour from a desert tree. And because it does not teach it, people assume it never existed. But it did. And it still does. In Peru and Mexico and across arid regions, different Prosopis species have been studied for their flowers, showing recurring patterns, high fiber, notable protein, and bioactive compounds, exactly what you would expect from a whole pod ground into food. PMC +2, Wiley Online Library +2. This is not a trend. It is an old technology, a tree that turns sunlight into shelf-stable flour. So why does the modern world treat that like a niche? Because it breaks the sweetness business model. Refined sugar creates an infinite loop. You buy it, you run out, you buy it again. And because it is cheap per calorie and easy to add to everything, it becomes an invisible foundation of modern products. Mesquite does not create that same loop. Mesquite is harvested. Mesquite is milled. Mesquite is used like flour. It's harder to industrialize into a global additive, harder to standardize, harder to extract into uniform crystals, and most importantly, mesquite can't be monopolized in the same way. It grows where people live, it can be gathered locally, it can be processed locally. It represents a kind of sweetness that doesn't require permission. And foods that don't require permission are dangerous to systems built on permission. That is the deep pattern hidden across forgotten foods. Not that they were too weak, that they were too independent. Now, listen carefully, because this is where the title matters. Mesquite is not sugar without consequences. That would be a new kind of propaganda, and we are not here to replace one myth with another. Mesquite is sweetness with structure, sweetness that comes with fiber, sweetness that comes with protein, sweetness that comes packaged in a form that the body must process more slowly than refined crystals. PMC +2, Science Direct +2. That's the honest claim. Not a miracle, a design difference. And that difference is exactly what refinement removes. Because refinement has one goal: make sweetness easier to extract, easier to store, easier to ship, easier to sell, easier to add to anything. In other words, make sweetness faster. Mesquite is the opposite. Mesquite slows sweetness down by refusing to separate it from food. That is why it was valuable in harsh environments. In the desert, a fast food is a problem. Fast food makes you hungry again. Fast food creates volatility. But a flour that carries sweetness inside fiber creates stability. And stability is survival. The people who built food systems around mesquite weren't optimizing macros. They were optimizing endurance. They understood something modern systems often forget. A food that lasts in your body matters more than a food that tastes strong for 5 seconds. And that brings us to the larger story. Sugarcane did not replace mesquite because it was better. Sugarcane replaced local sweetness systems because it fed a global machine. A machine that needed scale. A machine that needed concentrated labor. A machine that needed export crops and refineries and plantations. A machine that could turn land into revenue. Mesquite flour does not make the same machine. Mesquite flour makes something quieter. A landscape food, a regional staple, a local economy, a kind of sovereignty. And sovereignty is invisible to systems that profit from dependence. So mesquite became a tree you walk past, a tree you cut down, a tree you poison, a tree you burn. And in the process, a living archive of desert nutrition faded from public memory. But it never stopped existing. It kept producing pods. It kept making sweetness. It kept waiting for someone to remember what a pod means. Because the vault is not a museum. The vault is still alive. In community knowledge, mesquite pods are still gathered, dried, and ground. People still describe their sweetness as earthy, subtle, sometimes smoky, something you can bake into foods without turning them into candy. Oodom Action News +1. Researchers still describe mesquite flours as fiber-rich ingredients with meaningful protein compared to many conventional flours. PMC +1. And land managers still spend time and money trying to remove mesquite from certain grasslands, treating it as an encroaching shrub, often with herbicides, mechanical removal, and fire. U.S. Forest Service +2, USFS Research and Development +2. That contradiction should tell you everything. A plant can be food and be called a problem at the same time, not because reality is confusing, because economics are. The same tree can feed families and interfere with a business model. And when it interferes with a business model, it gets renamed. Brush, encroachment, weed tree, words are powerful. Words decide whether a plant is harvested or destroyed. And when the modern world chose refined sugar as default, it didn't just choose a taste, it chose an entire civilization path. It chose the refinery over the landscape, the plantation over the local grove, the commodity over the seasonal staple, the crystal over the pod. It chose speed over structure. And now, in an era of rising heat and water stress, the world is rediscovering what arid land foods always offered. Resilience is not always shiny. Resilience is often dusty. Resilience often comes in pods and tough trees and old milling stones. Mesquite is not a fantasy solution. It is a reminder. That sweetness once belonged to landscapes, not factories. That food security once came from perennial systems, not just annual fields. That humans survived harsh places by learning what could grow there, and by treating it as food, not brush. So here is the vault's lesson. The world did not forget mesquite because mesquite failed. The world forgot mesquite because mesquite didn't scale into the kind of dependence the modern food system is built on. And yet the tree is still here, still making pods, still offering a sweetness that arrives with fiber still attached, still waiting on the edge of the story. If this changed how you see sugar, if it changed how you see sweetness, then keep going. Because forgotten foods aren't nostalgia, they're options, they're resilience stored in biology. They're proof that the future might depend less on inventing something new, and more on remembering what we buried. This is Forgotten Earth Vault. If you want more long-form documentary stories, forgotten foods, erased knowledge, and survival systems hidden in plain sight, subscribe. The next vault opens soon.